Okay, we're going to move on now to part 2 of our discussion about sexuality and Jewish law in search of a balanced approach in Torah. Part 2 is entitled Halachic Positions Your Rabbi Never Told You, what Judaism really says about passion in the marital bed. As I mentioned in the first part, actually, this is a topic that I'm actually been researching very in depth, and I'm, God willing, will be coming out with a book about it in the next few weeks. And what got me involved in this topic was my own personal experience before I got married. I'm married now 10 years, so if we go back to 2005, the basic knowledge of what's allowed sexually between husband and wife back then was there were basically two sources that were spoken about. This is me talking to my friends. There are two sources. There's the Shulchan Aruch, who basically says everything is forbidden. Basically missionary style, face to face, husband on top. That's basically the only thing that's allowed. Oral sex, forbidden. Even looking at the genitals is forbidden. He mentions there about in Orach Chaim, Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim, Reish Mem. Basically, on the topic of sexual technique and positions between husband and wife, Shulchan Aruch basically he only talks about two creative positions: the wife on top or side by side, which he says are basically he denigrates them. So that was one shita, and the other shita was the Rambam. The Rambam says, "Ishte shaladam b'teraslei," a husband's wife is permitted to him. And again, before we get into this whole thing, I want to reiterate two things. One is that we're going to speak with direct language here when we talk about the different positions and techniques and things. We're going to speak in direct English, in line with the principle that in Torah sometimes speaks in a euphemistic, clean language when it's not related to halacha, but when it relates to halacha, one has to speak without ambiguity. And we will not speak provocatively, but we'll speak directly and clinically about all things sexual. Otherwise, I believe we've gained nothing. And the second thing is that in this particular topic about sex between husband and wife, the Jewish law generally talks in terms of what's permitted for the husband to do. It also generally talks in terms of the obligation of the husband rather than the wife. This is not because Judaism and halacha doesn't recognize that a wife has sexual needs. On the contrary, there's a lot more in Jewish law, maybe infinitely more in Jewish law, about the husband's obligation to fulfill his wife sexually than her obligation to fulfill him sexually. So if we can all set aside that sexist knee-jerk reaction, it would be helpful just to be able to approach the conversation, the discussion, and try to just understand the statements that are said maybe about the husband in regards to the couple. In any case, the Rambam says, Ishtei shel adam b'teraslei, a husband's wife is permitted to him. He can have sex with her anytime during her pure period when she's not menstruating. And it says that he can have intercourse with her. It says he can kiss any part of her body he wants. And he can have intercourse with her, whether vaginally, anally, or between limbs, which basically means between or against any other part of the body. The common, as far as I knew back then in 2005, the common way that the Rambam was quoted was that he then says, as long as it doesn't lead to wasting seed in vain. In our discussion, we're going to get to discuss the fact that in modern day Maimonidean scholars have actually removed that phrase, and they no longer include that caveat as coming from Maimonides himself, and you'll understand why as we go through the discussion. But in any case, this is what was understood by most people back when I was having my classes. But I did come across a surprising thing that most people didn't know, which is that back then at least, and even today, when I speak to people, they don't know it, is that in Shulchan Aruch, there's two places where Rav Yosef Karo speaks about sex law. One is in Orach Chaim Reish Mem, chapter 240, and another place is in Even HaEzer, which is the law in the laws of marriage, or laws of relationships, if you want to call it that, in Siman Chaf Hey, 25, Halacha 2. Simchaf Hey Sif Beis. And in the Shulchan Aruch we know is written by Yosef Kare and Rabbi Moshe Isserlis. I'm going to speak. I'm assuming my audience now is familiar with certain specific authorities and commentaries in the book. It will give many more introductions. The introduction itself is almost 50 pages to give background and understanding to each of these things. But in this discussion, I'm going to speak, assuming that my readers my listeners are familiar with, basic personalities and terminologies, halachic terminologies. So we all know that the most famous commentator on the Shulchan Aruch is the Rama. He usually gives the Ashkenazic approach to the Shulchan Aruch. He adds his gloss notes in because the Yosef Karo basically ruled according to between the Rambam, the Rif, and the Rosh. 2 out of 3 of them were Sephardim, and the Ashkenazim at the time that the Shulchan Aruch came out didn't agree with that approach because it basically ignored a great many Ashkenazic authorities. So the Rama came and adds in, key places where the Ashkenazic approach needs to be factored in. So what I discovered shortly before going to my own pre-marriage classes with a Chabad pre-marriage teacher was that the Rama, Moshe Isserlis, in Even Ezer rules like the Rambam. You see, most people, again, that I would speak to back then, they would say, there's the Shulchan Aruch and there's the Rambam, but we don't paskin like the Rambam, especially since we're Ashkenazim. So we're stuck with the Shulchan Aruch. And I never, for some reason, that these rules about who we paskin like, it's a whole other topic to be discussed. This whole issue that this whole concept, this whole notion that we have to paskin like the Shulchan Aruch because a group of rabbis in the 17th century, or not even an official group, but just rabbis in general, because it was convenient, because they didn't have access to books, or because they didn't want to rely on their own knowledge, or whatnot, or because they wanted to have a collective book that they all followed. There was no authority back then that could actually impose that upon all future generations, and that's a whole different topic we need to discuss. But in any case, the Rama, and Even Ezer paskins like the Rambam, and he goes even further and he says this idea that a husband can have intercourse vaginally or anally or between limbs as long as he doesn't waste seed. He quotes another opinion. He says that there are some who say you could waste seed, at least it says in regard to anal sex, that you could do it even to the point of ejaculation, as long as it's not constantly done. Now, when I went to my class with my teacher, it was 2 of us in the class. Usually he would have a group, but it was an accelerated course because I was working full time. I couldn't, and it was it wasn't a night class. And most of the class had to do with the calendar and figuring out the times of the month when you have to be careful. Maybe your wife might see her period, and then how much time between the period is the mikvah. That was the bulk of the 2-day class. Toward the very end, we had a relatively brief discussion about what's actually allowed in the bedroom. And this is basically what the teacher told us. He told us the Shulchan Aruch, which says that it doesn't really discuss positions other than the fact that a woman on top is not considered appropriate, and the side-by-side is not considered appropriate, and looking at the genitals, particularly a husband looking at his wife's genitals, is considered, there's no shame, it's considered evil, it's considered inappropriate and forbidden, because it shows that you have no shame and it's exciting the sexual urge. And to kiss there is even worse because it's transgressing the commandment not to make yourself disgusting. Commandment of Baal Tashaksu. That people who are familiar with the term will understand that there's a certain mitzvah in the Torah not to do things that make you feel disgusted and make others feel disgusted about you. And if we can sum it up in a general term. So that's what that's what he told us. That's basically the law. And he told us the Gemara in Nedarim, famous Gemara in Nedarim, which is not actually famous enough because most people I talk to don't even know that it exists, but at least they're not familiar with it in depth. All they might be familiar with is what I'm going to tell you now, which is what I was told, which is that the Gemara there says Rabbi Yochanan ben Dahavai, who was one of the, I think, later Tanaim, who was known to be a very ascetic person. If you look in Erchei Tanaim v'Amarayim from Kalanimus, who was one of the Rishonim, he says that he was a very ascetic person. He says that the ministering angels whispered to me 4 things. He says that, what did they whisper? He said, why are children, it says literally, why are there lame people? But the way that all the commentaries understand it is having to do with children. Why are children born lame? Which is a weird question, because children don't walk when they're born, but that's basically the idea. Why are children lame? So it answers because their parents overturn the table. Now, this is an example of the clean language that the Gemara uses. It's referring to a position other than missionary-style sex, but it leaves it very broad, and the commentaries argue over what this means, and we'll get to that in a minute. The second thing that they told this Rabbi Yochanan ben Nahave says that they told him was that why are there, I don't remember the order, but why are there children that are born blind? It's because the parents look at the genitals during intimacy, sex. Why are children born mute? They don't speak. It's because the parents kiss the genitals. It's generally understood to refer to the husband kissing the wife, but it says in general, it says they kiss the genitals. So Yaakov Emden actually brings a pasuk which kind of like implies that it's referring to both of them in his commentary on the Siddur. In any case, so why are there children who are mute? Because the parents kiss the genitals. And why are there children who are deaf and dumb? They can't hear or talk because the husband and wife speak during sex. So the Gemara discusses that and basically shows that you're allowed to talk if during even is implied that even during intercourse you're allowed to talk if it relates to the sexual act, which the commentaries again in the book will bring everything in very great detail. I can't get into it all here. I can't even remember it all, and if I would, we'd be sitting here for hours. But basically, the notion of what does sex-related talk mean is also very broad, and it can even include words that are spoken to increase the husband or wife's arousal, which would mean sexy talk. At least affectionate talk, but if we want to talk practically, it would even be on some kind of sexy talk, dirty talk. I don't know, what exactly these things meant to them, what it would mean to us, but the idea is that it would obviously be loving, but then and certainly technical things, move your leg here, move your leg there. I mean, that's obviously sex related. Now, that's what we were taught. So we were taught that if you do anything other than missionary position, your kids are going to be blind, deaf, lame, or dumb. And kissing or looking at the genitals is shameful and disgusting. That's what we were taught. That's it. And we actually, the rest of the conversation, from at least with the rabbi himself, was that we were like, how is it possible that God would punish a child for what the parents do? And I remember him giving the example of, well, if parents smoke and the kid turns out bad, turns out sick because the parents smoke, that's how things are. You can't blame God. But in any case, at one point I asked the rabbi, I said, well, what about the Rama in Even HaEzer? Specifically in regard to the oral sex question. He said, what do you mean? So I was first of all taken aback that he didn't know the source. I didn't know if he was just playing around with me. But in any case, I pulled out the book and showed it to him, and he immediately pointed to a commentary that says that the Rama says you can kiss any part of her body. The Rama is basically quoting the Rambam. A husband's wife is permitted to him. He can have sex anytime during the pure time period. He can kiss anywhere and penetrate anywhere. That's all the Rambam. So he immediately points to a commentary, the Beis Shmuel over there, which says that the Rama means anywhere but there. Now, at the time, I knew that there was a commentary. I thought it was the Atzei Razim, and later I checked it up, and it was. It's brought down in Atzei Poskim and elsewhere that totally negates the Beis Shmuel and says that he's wrong. There's other commentaries also. Ikvei Abayis, Reish Pina, which is in the Friedman Shulchan Aruch, is brought down there. The Lechem Mishnah. Of the Lechem Mishnah specifically talks about the Beis Shmuel. There's another one that specifically says that the Beis Shmuel is wrong. The Ber Moshe from Moshe Stern, the Debritzina Rav, speaks about it. But basically, the Beis Shmuel is wrong. Because if you're going to say that the Rama is not referring to kissing there, then the Rambam is not referring to kissing there. But in any case, this is what we were taught. So when I came out of that lesson, it was different than, like we said before, there's two stages where Judaism has the opportunity to give its constituents, its male constituents at least, a healthy attitude towards sex. One is when they reach puberty, and one is when they reach marriage. In the case of puberty, I was completely unequipped. I didn't have the information. But when it came to marriage, to the marriage classes, I had a little bit of information. So I knew already that I wasn't being given all the information. So then I came back, and friends of mine would get engaged, and I would tell them, ask them what they were taught. Other people, they would tell me what they learned. Some had more stringent teachers, some had more lenient teachers. Sometimes the husband would be taught one thing and the wife would be taught something else, which is a recipe for disaster in the bedroom. And I started hearing all kinds of very unfortunate stories. I'm not going to get into details because it's not appropriate. But, and people being taught all kinds of crazy things, but the lenient approach, which was kind of like starting to gain ground, and still is like what's quoted today. The lenient view was, you can do anything you want except wasting seed. The most lenient people would say that. What I came to actually was shocked to come to realize in researching this was that that's not really the whole case. And the Rama himself says it. So what we're going to do is actually go through just 3 Gemaras and try to understand, where did the Shulchan Aruch get his view from, and the Rama? Like, how did they both come from the same Torah? Like, how do they understand this Gemara? How does the Rama permit these things? How did the Rama permit these things when the Gemara clearly says your kids are going to be messed up? So it basically comes down to, there's 3 Gemaras, and there's 2 Pseudo-Talmudic texts that need to be basically analyzed in all this. And then when you look through the Rishonim, you can get an understanding of how this all came to be. The first Gemara is the Gemara Nedarim. Okay, we just quoted part of that Gemara. The Gemara actually starts off by saying that a person who stares at other women, his children will turn out uncouth. And then 2 other sages, one comes and says that this refers to even your own wife when she's Anita. The other one says that it says that when you stare at other women, it says referring to the heel, it says her heel. So this other sage comes and says it doesn't really mean the heel, it means her genitals, which are kind of opposite the heel. Again, a clean way of speaking. And then the Gemara says that shame, boishas panim, shamefacedness is a virtuous quality, because someone who has boishas panim doesn't come to sin easily. After that quote, then it brings Rabbi Yochanan ben Dahavai, his teaching in the name of the 4 ministering angels, in the name of the ministering angels, about the 4 behaviors that cause 4 congenital birth defects. And then comes the next part of the Gemara, which my teacher didn't tell me. The next part of the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan bar Napcha was one of the, first of the Amoraim, one of the greatest Amoraim. He says that according to the Chachamim, whoever these Chachamim were, this was the view of Rabbi Yochanan ben Dahavai. But the halacha is not like Rabbi Yochanan ben Dahavai. Rather, Kol ma she'adam reitz lasos be'ishta eisa. Anything a husband craves to do sexually with his wife, he can do. Now again, let's try not to jump in with the sexist knee-jerk reaction that husband with wife. Rest assured that, according to pretty much everyone in Jewish law, you can't do anything to your wife that she doesn't want done. So we can translate it as anything a couple wants to do, they can do. And then the rationale the Gemara kind of gives there is that just like a person is allowed to eat, once his meat is kosher, he's allowed to eat his kosher meat any way he wants. So a husband and wife, shall we say, can enjoy each other's bodies any way they agree and want. And then it brings 2, but then the Gemara says, wait a second. Then it brings an Amira from a much later Amira, I think a 6th or 7th generation Amira, a Maimar. And a Maimar says, well, who were these ministering angels then? He says they were not real actual angels, they were Rabbanan. Now, we said Rabbi Yochanan quotes the Chachamim saying that the law doesn't go like Rabbi Yochanan ben Dahavai. A Maimar is saying that Rabbi Yochanan ben Dahavai was actually quoting Rabbanan. So here we have Chachamim versus Rabbanan. What was the difference? Remains to be explored. some working theories, but in any case, it's not so important at this point. But what he brings out, what Meimar actually says is, these ministering angels were actually Rabbanan. He called them ministering angels because they're kind of like removed and high, elevated above the rest of the people. But they must have been humans. Why? Must have been human rabbis, because if they were ministering angels, then why would Rabbi Yochanan and the Chachamim not paskin like them? They have the secrets of fetal development revealed to them. So it must be that they were humans. Now, what people I don't think really catch between the lines is that the Gemara is clearly admitting that the rabbis didn't have perfect science. Why? Because you're saying that if they had perfect fetal science, if the rabbis had perfect fetal science, then the Chum would have agreed with them. The Chum were saying, no, your science of fetal development is flawed, meaning all your threats are empty. Your threat that this is going to cause your kid to be blind and lame and this, it's all nonsense. And therefore, scientifically, and therefore the halacha doesn't follow you. So this is just parenthetically a very interesting example where if you actually read between the lines, you see the Gemara admitting that they themselves didn't have perfect science. Because the Meimar specifically says that the difference between the rabbis and the ministering angels would have been about their knowledge of science. So the way, and then what happens, then the Gemara quotes two stories, one of Rebbe Yehuda Nasi, who was the teacher, one of the teachers of Rabbi Yochanan, and Rav, who was a teacher and elder colleague of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was in Israel, Rav was in Babylonia. That was their main careers. And a case where a wife came to them, each one, and complained that or at least informed them that it says they set a table for their husband, and their husband overturned them. It doesn't say what overturned means. And in each case, the rabbi permitted it. Rebbe permitted it to the woman who came to him, and Rav permitted it to the wife who came to him. So what you have at the end of the Gemara in Nedarim is the Chachamim, according to a Meimar, believe that these four behaviors are not only perfectly halachically okay, they're perfectly scientifically safe. Nothing to be worried about. But my teacher didn't tell us that. Okay, that's A. Now we're going to jump to throw in, before we get to the other Gemaras, we're going to go to Masechta Kala and Kala Rapsi. Now, again, there's a lot of information in these, and we didn't even analyze everything on Nedarim. And we're not going to be able to analyze everything in Kala Rapti, because in the book we're going to go through every single part of the Gemara and every part of Kala Rapti and Masechta Kala. Masechta Kala and Kala Rapti are basically kind of like pseudo-Talmudic texts. We don't exactly know their origins. Some people say that they were books that were already studied in the time of the sages. But they deal with marital and sexual law. And they basically have a completely different, they have like revised versions, or perhaps even original versions. It's not clear which one came first, the Gemara or Kala Rapti or Masechta Kala. Kala Rapti is kind of like a commentary on Masechta Kala. In any case, to summarize what comes out of Masechta Kala, Kala Rapti, that according to Kala Rapti, the Chachamim actually admitted to Rabbi Yochanan ben Dahavai that these four behaviors are dangerous. They're all four do cause these four congenital birth defects. But two things. They're still permitted. So they're halachically permitted even though they're dangerous to the child. And B, they're only dangerous if the child is conceived the same night or during the same sexual encounter in which these behaviors were performed. But any other time, if conception doesn't occur in the same sexual encounter, then there's no danger to the child. This is an important distinction between the two. Now, here's where we're going to analyze just slightly Nedarim, this whole Gemara, and it'll help us understand a little where Yosef Kare and the Rama were coming from, the Rishonim. Basically, there's two important questions that we need to analyze for our discussion. There's more that will be analyzed again in the book. But the two questions is, first of all, what does overturning the table mean? What does this term mean, overturning the table? The second question is, when Rabbi Yochanan came and said that the Chachamim say, this is the view of Rabbi Yochanan the Havai, but we don't hold like him. The halacha is not like him, right? That would imply that all four things are permitted. You're allowed to overturn the table without worry. You're allowed to will stare. Actually, the wording there, I don't know if I made it clear before. It doesn't say you're not allowed, that Rabbi Yochanan ben Havi didn't say there was a problem with looking at the genitals. He said with staring. Okay, it's a very important distinction. In any case. So, the question is, when Rabbi Yochanan came and said that according to the Chachamim, the law is not like Rabbi Yochanan ben Havi. Does that mean that all four of these things are okay? Overturning the table, staring at the genitals, kissing the genitals, and unrestricted sex talk. Or, now, we would obviously assume, yeah, they're all okay. Why? What did the Chacham say? They said, Kol masha adam reitzeh lasos v'ishtoisa. Anything a man wants to do with his wife, he can do. Or anything the couple wants to do, they can do. Anything. The reason I'm bringing it up is because actually one of the key commentators comes and says, no, they were only permitting one thing. And we're going to get to that in a minute. So first of all, what were they talking about? What does overturning the table mean? So basically, I don't have all I can't remember the whole list of them, but if you go through all the Rishonim, there's basically, some say it refers to rear entry vaginal intercourse. Okay? In modern jargon, it would be referred to as doggy style. In the way the sages refer to it is ma'aseh behema, which would be animal style. This is the term that the Chachamim actually use. So if you object to the term doggy style, use the Chachamim's preference, animal style. Or face to back, panim keneged erev. Those are the two rabbinic terms. So there's a whole slew, including Masechta Kala. Some versions of Masechta Kala already say that it refers to ma'aseh behema, and there's a bunch of Rishonim, the Ravid, in Bali Nefesh Shar Kedusha says that interprets it that way. And other Rishonim. The majority of Rishonim interpret it to mean anal intercourse. Other Rishonim, including the Rambam actually, who permits anal intercourse, but he interprets the definition of overturning the table as the wife on top. There's a whole bunch of Rishonim who permit that. One Rishon, interestingly enough, I believe it's the Rabbeinu Peretz, he describes that it's a vaginal intercourse with the wife facing away from the husband. Meaning the wife is on top, facing away. So it's a combination of two. And then Rashi actually brings three interpretations, which it could be he's referring to them all combined as one position combining three different elements. Or he may have just been saying that this is overturning the table as a general term, which refers to anything that is non-missionary. But Rashi brings down face to back, shalei kedarka. Shalei kedarka means usually translated as unnatural intercourse. Always refers to anal intercourse. And even though some commentaries try to argue it, try to twist it to mean that it's referring to animal style, but it's wrong. And the commentaries prove it that it's wrong. In any case, Rashi says face to back, anal intercourse, and her on top. So Rashi brings all three. Now it could mean a combination, or it could mean that he's just giving a general meaning that overturning the table just means anything unusual. Now the question is, a separate question, by the way, is why did the Chachamim believe that a husband can do anything he wants with his wife? Okay, and we get into that more in the book, but I'll just throw out a few that I can remember offhand. I believe there was four basic reasonings. One reasoning was that, the Gemara compares it there to a man can eat his meat any way he wants, right? So it's saying the same, just like meat is not kosher until it's slaughtered and prepared properly, and then once it is, you can eat it any way you want. Roasted, it says roasted, salted, or grilled, or whatever, or baked. So too, sex is forbidden with a forbidden woman until the relationship is established on kosher grounds. And once it's established that way, then everything's permitted. This is the kind of like the wording that the way that Sefer Eshkol, or an early Rishon, Ravid the second, kind of discusses it. Another explanation brought the Meiri brings is that God, there's certain levels of sanctification within intimacy, which we're not going to get into here. You'll have to buy the book for that. But he says that even though there's different levels of sanctification, but God doesn't expect every person to be able to do that. So the baseline law is you can do whatever you want. And then there's another explanation, which is specifically in regard to, let's say, anal sex, is that in Jewish law, forbidden intercourse applies whether it's vaginal or anal. So therefore, once the relationship is established on permissive grounds, then both are permitted. And as we'll see, even to the point of, with anal sex, even to the point of ejaculation, according to a great majority, many opinions, perhaps even the majority. In any case, but what about how many of these things Rabbi Yochanan and the Chacham were coming to permit? So again, they said anything a man wants to do, which implies all four. The Ravid the third, in Bali Nefesh, Shar Kedusha, comes and says no. When the Chachamim came and said that you can do anything you want, they were only referring to overturning the table. And it only means rear entry, vaginal intercourse, not to anal intercourse. Why? Why only this one? Well, he says, because look, the Gemara goes on and brings examples only about this. And we know from another Gemara which talks about, by Rav, that it says, the famous Gemara, that Rav, when he was in bed with his wife, was joking around with her, and Rav Kahana, his student, was under the bed and said, Rav, he said, Rebbe is like, it sounds like what's coming out of your mouth sounds like you've never tasted sex in your life. Literally, it says you've never tasted food. It says a euphemism for sex. Clearly, Rav was speaking like almost excessively, probably sexual. I mean, that's the implication. That's what's implied. So Ravid says that, over there it says that you're only allowed to, so the Gemara over there says it's okay. Rav over there says that a person is called to task even for the excess, lightheaded talk that he speaks with his wife, which the commentaries explain means to the talk between husband and wife before intimacy. So the Gemara asks, how could that be if Rav Kahana heard Rav laughing and joking with his wife in such excess? So the Gemara gives an answer that if the wife needs to be put in the mood, then it's okay. And it can even not be sex related. The commentaries explain that Nedarim made a distinction between sex related and non-sex related. On the Chagiga, Hamid Beis, which is a discussion with Rav, it's not about sex related or not, it's about whether the wife needs to be put in the mood or not. And if she needs to be put in the mood, it's okay, but if not, then it's considered excess. In the case of Rav, in Chagiga Hamid Beis, she had to be put in the mood, so therefore it was okay to be in such excess. What people don't realize is that the Gemara actually brings another. There's two Gersais which bring another answer in the Gemara, which says that when Rav said not to speak so excessively, it was referring to, and clearly about sexual talk, it was talking about after intercourse. But by Rav, the way he acted with his wife was before intercourse, which is pretty strong answer, which is basically saying that before intercourse, it doesn't matter, does your wife need to be put in the mood, not be put in the mood. It implies that God doesn't expect you to be able to control what's coming out of your mouth when you're in the throes of passion. It's a very, very interesting girsa, which is not brought by Ravid, but it's important to know. So, in any case, Ravid says that, overturning the table is the only thing. That's okay. Why? Because we see they brought cases only of that. In regard to talking, we see the story of Chagiga and Chagiga Hamid Beis, where you're only allowed to talk if it's needed to put her in the mood, which straight off the bat will tell you there's no connection, because you could on Nadarim they're talking about sex-related talk, but they're talking about being put in the mood. Halachically they're different. Ravid seems to kind of equate them. The second thing that Ravid says is that staring at the genitals is not allowed because it's no shame, and you're supposed to have shamefacedness, right? Like we said, Nadarim speaks about that. So I'm immediately just off the bat going to say that also can easily be knocked off, this argument of Ravid, because if you and in the book we address it at length, and it's actually going to require a complete dedicated essay to deciphering how Ravid understood the Gemara. But the teaching about shamefacedness over there in that Gemara was brought in the relation to the Gemara, to the teaching before it about staring at women in general, or even your wife when she's menstruating. But look, staring at forbidden women, not to your wife when she's pure in a case of intimacy. This is actually proven by the fact that you see, there's other versions of this Gemara in Masechta Derech Eretz where it doesn't even bring Rabbi Yochanan ben Dahavai. It only brings the story about staring at other women, and then it brings the story of shamefacedness. Bir Agra in Even Ezer also says that the shamefacedness was brought in relation to the story before it. And the reason, the Meiri says that the whole story about looking at a woman's heel and her which means her genitals or her backside, he says it refers to basically checking her out. That if a woman walks by a guy in public, it's referring to checking out her body. It's a very simple, practical thing. And a person who's willing to stand in public and doesn't care that people are looking at and checking out a woman has no shamefacedness. Not to mention the fact that, if you're going to say that the Chachamim disagreed with Rabbi Yochanan ben Dahavai about, all these four things, then even if the shamefacedness thing was brought in relation to Rabbi Yochanan ben Dahavai, it means the Chachamim said, we don't hold that it applies. So you can't say, the shamefacedness was brought in regards to Rabbi Yochanan ben Dahavai, so even though you knock off Rabbi Yochanan ben Dahavai, you still accept the shamefacedness. No. If the shamefacedness applies to Yochanan ben Dahavai, and you reject Yochanan ben Dahavai about staring or kissing, it means you reject the shamefacedness there. Why? Because between husband and wife, there should be no shame. There is no shame. That's so much for Ravid's thing about shamefacedness. Then Ravid says that by kissing the genitals, not only does it have shamefacedness, but it's also bal tashaksu. It's disgusting. Problem with that is that Ravid brings two examples from the Gemara. To prove his point. One example is that you're not allowed to drink water from a bloodletting cupping horn. It's used for bloodletting. The second example is a story where Rav once saw Rav Kahana putting an insect in front of his mouth, and he said, "Don't do it because someone's going to think you're transgressing the prohibition of bal tashaksu." Now, what these have to do with a person with oral sex, I have no idea. Now, if you want, you could say maybe it has to do with the hygiene, even maybe certain, as silly as it sounds, certain insects that might be, in that area. These things can be resolved by proper hygiene or, cleanliness in our day and age. And just from a hygienic perspective, what may have been considered disgusting then is not considered disgusting now. The fact of the matter is that something, according to what you find in Encyclopedia Talmudis, says that anything which the Chacham didn't outright forbid as a matter of bal tashaksu is not forbidden unless the entire world finds it disgusting. But if it's something that's not actually forbidden by the Gemara and you personally find it not disgusting, then there's no problem. And the fact is that there's a great number of men and women who don't find this to be a disgusting thing. So with all due respect to the Ravid, I'm putting it out there, this is easily rebuffed. So, but in any case, that's the Ravid's opinion. The Ravid basically says that they only came to permit overturning the table, and it refers to rear entry, vaginal intercourse. Now, what did the Ravid hold in terms of the punishment, the danger though? So it's not 100% clear, whether that he still believed these three things would hurt the child. It's clear that he held that overturning the table would not hurt the child. In regard to the other three, he says, even though a person is not judged for them a severe judgment, still there's an isser yesh b'hem, he says. There's an isser. It would seem to imply that when he says there's no din chamor, there's no harsh judgment, it means that the kids are not going to be hurt. The problem with that is that earlier he references in regard to unrestricted sex talk, he references a discussion he has earlier in that chapter in Shara Kedusha, where he actually says that the punishment for speaking inappropriately during sex is that your kids will be deaf, mutes. So if he still believed it there, and did he still believe it later in the chapter when he's discussing, that they don't have a din chamor? I don't know. Basically, we may have to assume that the Ravid believed that these three, that overturning the table is permitted and safe, and the other three are forbidden and possibly dangerous. Whether it's only dangerous the night of conception or not, it's not clear. So, if we may, we then have three opinions. We have Nadarim, but that's only the Ravid. According to all the other Rishonim, the Rambam, Bira Gra says this in the Rambam, Lechem Mishnah says this in the Rambam, it's clear from Perish Mishnayos of the Rambam, and many other commentaries who don't, who just take the Gemara as it is, and again, we list them all in the book. But pretty much everyone else, and everyone who passes like the Rambam, all held that, like Nadarim, like the simple reading of Nadarim, that all four are permitted, all four are safe. Kala Rabti basically comes and says that all four are permitted, all four are dangerous, but only on the night of conception. And Ravid comes and says only one is permitted and safe, the other three are forbidden, and we don't really know for sure are they safe or not, and if only the night of conception or not, or the encounter of conception. Now, let's move on to the next Gemara. So we just said that Ravid, for instance, said that that overturning the table refers to rear entry vaginal intercourse, not to anal intercourse. But there's a Gemara which clearly permits anal intercourse. If you look in the Gemara in Sanhedrin, in Chasidic Beis, over there the Gemara starts off with we don't need to get into detail about it. It's a little bit lengthy, but basically the Gemara there states, according to Rava, an unequivocal opinion that anal intercourse is permitted. Actually, it's interesting because Rava is the same one in Kalarapti who came and said that the dangers were only the night of conception. So it could be that Rava, who held in Sanhedrin that anal intercourse is permitted, maybe, if Kalarapti can be taken as a reliable source, it could be that Rava would also hold that anal intercourse could harm the child if performed on the same night as conception. Some of the later commentaries actually try to prove that overturning the table could not possibly mean anal intercourse. Why? Because you can't conceive from it, right? And the whole issue was if you're going to conceive from it, then the child's going to be hurt from the conception, but anal intercourse doesn't have conception. So one commentary comes and says that, Rabbi Yisrael Nakwa and Nar Samara says that, by overturning the table, it could hurt the kid even if it's not the night of conception. The truth is you don't even need such an answer, because just like kissing the genitals or staring at the genitals don't cause conception, right? They're done before intercourse, and then the intercourse causes conception. Same thing with anal intercourse. Obviously, those who say that, who understand the Rambam even, to say that you could do anal intercourse without ejaculation, they understood that you were then going to do the ejaculation in the womb, which creates major hygienic problems. But the bottom line is, that's no proof that overturning the table couldn't refer to anal intercourse. But in any case, Sanhedrin and Chasidic Beis, like we said, Rava says it's permitted, but maybe he might still consider it dangerous if done on the same night as conception. But from this, we would have to say that Ravid holds that anal intercourse is also permitted, right? In Bali Nefesh, he says that overturning the table refers to rear entry, vaginal. But Sanhedrin says that anal intercourse is permitted. Not only that, there's proof that Ravid actually probably holds this, because in the Mishnah Torah, where the Rambam permits anal intercourse, the Ravid doesn't argue with him. Interestingly, the Ravid doesn't argue with him either about kissing the genitals, which would suggest that the Ravid's book Shari Nefesh, Bali Nefesh Shar Kedusha may have really been about sanctification of sex, not about necessarily the baseline law. And if you read that whole chapter, actually, the whole beginning is all about sanctification. Even when he talks about Nedarim and what's said over on Nedarim, he says there's certain things that, kind of degrade the act. But he doesn't say, he eventually says there's an Isser in them, some of these things, but the general context of the whole chapter is not about law, it's about sanctification. So whether or not one could argue that Bali Nefesh was more an issue of sanctification, whereas in Mishnah Torah, even the Ravid himself ultimately agreed to the Rambam and didn't argue about it, it's open for debate. The Yad Aron actually mentions this as well, but I haven't seen any other commentaries raise this issue about the Ravid being silent on Mishnah Torah. He doesn't discuss Sanhedrin, as being the reason why he's quiet, but it would seem that would be the reason why the Ravid was quiet on Mishnah Torah. In any case, one commentary actually, who we'll see later, Sefer Charedim, tries to reinterpret the whole Gemara over there to prove that it was not coming to permit anal intercourse. But we're not going to be able to analyze it in depth, here in this discussion. But he does that because he's trying to prove, because he believes that the Ravid for sure does not permit anal intercourse. So that's why he has to find a way to twist the Sanhedrin. In the later commentary, El Yerabba on the Lavush, Siman Reish Mem, Chadalid, Sifkat and Yud, basically says that, Sefer Charedim, he uses the word Eino L'ma'ayin. I'm not sure exactly what the meaning of that is. I mean, it's not worth reading. I don't know. But if you read the Sefer Charedim, and in the book we address it, it's extremely problematic. And it's all because he was trying to prove that the Ravid could not permit anal intercourse. In any case, I also want to bring up, in the book we actually bring in the introduction, I should have brought it up earlier. You're going to find in the rabbinic writings we were talking about anal intercourse here. It's not because this is something that's what people are into, but it's because in the rabbinic writings there's an inordinate amount of discussion about it. Why? Because it relates to the question of wasting seed in vain, which we're going to get to next. And it ultimately is very significant in regards to what's permitted with husband and wife, not necessarily because of anal intercourse, but because of other sexual activities that husband and wife may want to engage in that include ejaculation outside of the wife's womb. So just want to put it out there that this is not about an obsession with anal sex. If anything, it's in the rabbinic works. So we're just translating and transmitting. So we have Nedarim, which says that overturning the table is okay. We have Sanhedrin, which says, and one last thing, by the way, again, I'm sorry. In regards to Ravid, that Ravid said that, that the women, that why do you say overturning the table is permitted, and maybe not the others, because they brought cases of rabbis only permitting overturning the table. Interestingly enough, that's not a proof at all, because some of the commentaries say that overturning the table there must refer to anal sex, because that's why the wives were coming to complain, because it was uncomfortable. Ravid himself doesn't hold that it was referring to anal sex. He says it was referring to rear entry vaginal intercourse, and therefore their question was, is it permitted? But according to other commentaries, their question was, they came to the rabbi saying it was uncomfortable, and maybe their concern was that it would affect their child. Again, all these concerns about the children being affected is also connected to ancient beliefs, that people's behaviors and mindsets and feelings and experiences during intercourse will affect the child. Maybe they were afraid that if they were experiencing some measure of pain, even if they agreed to do it, it would have hurt the child. In any case, the rabbis were saying it's okay. But what do we deduce from here? That the fact that no women came and complained that their husbands were staring at their genitals or kissing their genitals or talking to them during sex, who says the women would come to complain about it? Maybe they enjoyed it. So again, Ravid's arguments are very tenuous. In any case, moving on, again, Nedarim says overturning the table is permitted. Sanhedrin Nun Chesed Beis says Shalei Kedarka, anal sex is permitted. And now we have a third Gemara, and that's Yevamis Lamed Daled Amud Beis. Yevamis Lamed Daled Amud Beis speaks about Erva Einin, which we discussed already earlier. This is the Gemara that we spoke about, where it said that they asked, well, why did we know Einin didn't want to have a child because he didn't want his son to be not considered his, but why did Er not want to have a child? And it's because he didn't want Tamar to lose her beauty. But the Gemara there basically says that the sin of Erva Einin was not what we generally think it is, that they basically pulled out. It's called, in Latin, coitus interruptus. But rather, it was anal sex. That the way that they prevented pregnancy was through anal sex. So, Tosfos, there's an obvious question. Tosfos over there asks, and Tosfos in Sanhedrin and Chesed Beis also asks. It says, wait a second. We have Sanhedrin Nun Chesed Beis, which says that anal sex is permitted. We have Nedarim 20a and 20b, which says that overturning the table is permitted, and most Rishonim, including Tosfos itself, understands it to mean anal sex. So how could it be that Yevamis 34b is saying that anal sex was the sin of Erva Einin for which they were killed? So here is the critical view of Rabbeinu Yitzchak, brought in Tosfos. Rabbeinu Yitzchak was a contemporary of the Rambam and the Ravid. He was a great Kabbalist, he was a great Chassid. It says that he used to fast 2 Yom Kippurs. Whatever, he was a very pious person, based on the Feldheim biography that I read. And Rabbeinu Yitzchak comes and gives 2 answers. One answer is that Nedarim and Sanhedrin were only permitting anal sex without ejaculation, not to the point of climax. Erva Einin did it to the point of climax, and it was wasting seed. So therefore, that was the sin. That's the difference. But then Rabbeinu Yitzchak comes and gives them a second answer. And the second answer is that the sin of Erva Einin was that they would ejaculate in the course of anal intercourse constantly, and with the intention of wasting seed, meaning to prevent pregnancy. But he says, if a husband has an erotic pleasure to have anal intercourse and ejaculate in the course of that, if it's done from time to time, just out of pleasure, in the heat of passion, out of pleasure, not for the sake of preventing pregnancy, if that's not really his core, purpose, then it's okay. In Sanhedrin 58b, it actually goes further. He says that if that roiv, the majority of his intercourses need to be vaginal. But as long as roiv of them are vaginal, then that's fine. He could engage in anal intercourse even to the point of ejaculation. Now, if you go through the Rishonim, most Rishonim who quote Rabbeinu Yitzchak agree with the second opinion. The Rosh says that that's the Iker. I think the Rabbeinu Yerucham, the Mordechai, again, it's listed in the book, but surprisingly, this whole, again, going back to 2005 when I was getting married, and in the years after that, when guys were being told, the lenient approach was you can do anything you want except wasting seed. When climax must be in the proper place. It's clearly not like that, at least in regard to anal sex. And this is where the Rama actually gets it in Even Ezer. He quotes this. He says that some say you can even ejaculate through anal sex, and he's quoting Tosfos, the Rabbeinu Yitzchak from Tosfos, as long as it's occasionally in the heat of passion, not as a regular, constant means of birth control. Tosfos Rid says the same thing on Yevamah Yud Beis and Beis, 12b, and he even says even stronger that if a husband is doing this, meaning having anal sex to the point of climax just for the sake of pleasure, it's not even considered wasting seed in vain. It's a very strong wording. It's not in the category. Again, there's many Rishonim who rule according to this. Now, what about the Rambam? So, now that we understand the two opinions of the Tosfos, we can now appreciate the Rambam's ruling as it was promoted until now, and how scholars today have now believe it should be changed. Until now, the Rambam's ruling was husband can have sex with his wife anytime he wants during her pure period, kiss any place he wants, and have intercourse vaginally, anally, or between limbs, as long as it doesn't lead to wasting seed in vain. That would seem to match the first view of Rabbeinu Yitzchak, right? That anal sex is permitted, but not to the point of climax. According to modern scholars, who have, now that we've reassessed, that they've compared and evaluated ancient manuscripts of the Rambam, including the Yemenite manuscripts, which are among the most reliable, the Rambam never wrote that himself, that last line. Meaning, you would be able to have anal intercourse and intercourse between limbs, which we'll discuss next, even to the point of ejaculation. Why? Because that would be in line with the second view of Tosfos, which is that you can have anal sex even to the point of ejaculation if it's for the sake of erotic pleasure, sexual fulfillment, not just for the sake of birth control. In fact, with that reasoning, even having the line there about as long as it doesn't lead to wasted seed in vain, you could technically leave that in, and the interpretation and meaning of that is as long as you're not doing it for birth control, right? It also explains why later on, when the Rambam actually the Rambam here is in Sefer Kedusha, Yisuri Bia, chapter 21, Halacha 9. In that same chapter, in chapter 18, the Rambam gives different examples of wasting seed, and the examples he gives of like coitus interruptus, or marrying a girl who's underage where she can never get pregnant, these are examples that are brought in the Gemara of clear intention for pregnancy. So one could then understand as well that earlier had nothing to do with avoiding pregnancy, and therefore nothing to do with wasting seed in vain either. Now, so much for anal sex. So until now, let's just evaluate for a minute. So we basically, until now, we have the vast majority of Rishonim, basically everyone except the Ravid, and one other opinion, the Oil Mayid, who basically endorses Ravid. All the Rishonim hold that all four behaviors are permitted. Overturning the table, kissing the genitals, staring at the genitals, kissing the genitals, and really technically unrestricted sex talk as well. you have combining all the different Rishonim, their definitions of overturning the table. You have permission for animal style sex, you have permission for anal sex, you have permission for her on top facing the other way, you have permission for basically every position and pretty much any behavior. Except even anal intercourse to the point of climax. The only thing that we haven't touched upon yet is sexual techniques, let's say, where the wife is stimulating the husband, not through intercourse, right? Whether as they, today, whether manually with her hand or other parts of the body. This is what's called derech evarim, between limbs. So, as we just discussed already, even the Rambam, who discusses derech evarim, right? If that last line about not wasting seed in vain doesn't apply to derech evarim either. Why? Because what's the difference between derech evarim versus anal intercourse? According to some opinions who learn that the reason why anal intercourse is permitted is because of the verse, it talks about 2 places of a woman's intercourse. So they might say that it can only refer to intercourse, to anal sex, not to intercourse between limbs. But according to the simple, understanding, there's no difference between intercourse between limbs and anal intercourse. And one of the major commentaries on the Torah, the Drisha, actually comes out straight and says it. The Drisha, Rabbi Yeshua Falk, who was actually a Talmud of the Rama, he rules in the Drisha, in Even Ezer, Siman Chav Gimel, Sif Katan Aleph, and in Siman Chav Hey, Sif Katan Beis, I think in his Isius in the Drisha, I think is Hey and Vav, he says basically over there that according to Rabbeinu Yitzchak, there is no issue, the Gemara in Nida, which talks about wasting seed, it doesn't apply to a case where the husband is doing it for pleasure, by anal intercourse, according to Rabbeinu Yitzchak. And according to Rabbeinu Yitzchak, if it's not only anal intercourse which is permitted, but also derech evarim. Also any stimulation against any part of the wife's body, which would include the hand, the mouth. He says it's okay even to the point of climax. Now, the question now is how come they don't tell us any of this? Most people are basically told, missionary style, anything else is disgusting, forbidden, and it'll make your kids turn out unhealthy. So, to make a long story short, basically what happened was, the Ravid, like I said before, was a lone voice among the Rishonim, but he was put kind of on center stage when Yaakov ben Asher, the Rosh's son, wrote the Torah. In the Torah, Yaakov ben Asher basically quotes, both in Orach Chaim and in Even Ezer, the entire Ravid on this whole topic. In Orach Chaim, he also quotes Rabbeinu Yitzchak's interpretation of overturning the table, referring to anal intercourse even to the point of climax. In the Torah, he quotes the Rambam's opinion and Rabbeinu Yitzchak's opinion, and then quotes the Ravid many pages later. So there's a little bit of confusion in terms of among the commentaries about what the Torah actually paskind. Some say that he paskind like the Ravid because in Even Ezer he brought the Ravid second, or last, pages later after the Rambam. And the Rabbeinu Yitzchak, when it's really a discussion there about sanctification, not about baseline law, he brings the Ravid last, so he paskins like the Ravid. The problem is that Orach Chaim, he brings the Ravid first, and then Rabbeinu Yitzchak, so then it would seem he paskins like Rabbeinu Yitzchak. So the bottom line is it's inconclusive from the Torah who he paskins like. But he brings the Ravid. First of all, he brings the Ravid, and the second point is that Rabbi Yosef Kare now becomes the key critical point of departure. Because during the Rishonim, again, you had the majority of them being very lenient, basically permitting the Rambam and Rabbeinu Yitzchak, meaning permitting kissing the genitals and any positions, and even to climax. They didn't say, the Rambam says derech evarim, and if we assume that he didn't say there's a problem with climax, then it would mean even with climax. The Drisha came later after Beis Yosef, after Yosef Kare, and said that even derech evarim is okay with climax. But in regards to Shalei Kadarka itself, in regards to anal sex itself, the Beis Yosef, Kare, wrote in his commentary to the Torah that basically that Rabbeinu Yitzchak, that someone who is, he writes twice. He writes in the Beis Yosef, he says that somebody who is conscientious of his soul should stay away from anal sex with ejaculation. And he says in the Bedek Abayis, which was a revision of his commentary, he adds in that if Rabbeinu Yitzchak, the Tosfos, the Baal Tosfos, Rabbeinu Yitzchak had seen the Zohar, and that the Zohar says that that the punishment for wasting seed is worse than any other sin, if Rabbeinu Yitzchak had seen that, then he would never have permitted anal sex to the point of climax. Now, and then what do you have in the Shulchan Aruch? Remember, the Shulchan Aruch, many people don't understand this. The Shulchan Aruch is the cliff notes of the Beis Yosef. Yosef Kare's magnum opus was not the Shulchan Aruch. His magnum opus was the Beis Yosef, which basically brings the sources and reasonings behind the Torah's presentation. And sometimes in the Beis Yosef, the Yosef Kare will bring up Psak or how he rules, and then the Shulchan Aruch basically is supposed to bring the final ruling. It's some cliff notes and a memorization device, as Yosef Kare writes himself in the introduction to the Beis Yosef. So technically, we shouldn't even be teaching people Chasanim and Kalas. We should not be teaching them sex law out of the Shulchan Aruch. We should be teaching it out of the Beis Yosef so they get a greater understanding. Now, but what happened was, Yosef Kare in the Shulchan Aruch basically left everything out. He left out the Rambam's view, permitting kissing the genitals, which would include in it staring the genitals, because the Rabbi considers kissing worse than staring, so if you permit kissing, staring would be included. The Yosef Kare leaves out the Rambam. He leaves out any discussion about anal sex at all, with climax, without climax. And all he tells you is that staring is shame. It should be ashamed of it. Kissing is disgusting, and her on top of him, side by side is not appropriate. It doesn't say it's forbidden, but he says it's not appropriate. So, on many levels, the Yosef Kare, the Shulchan Aruch, is responsible for a major shift. Usually we assume it was the Catholic Church's influence. It seems to be really that it was first of all Yosef Kare, together with other colleagues of his in Tzfas at the same time, because what you have at the same time is you have the Reishis Chachma, who comes and argues that the Daran couldn't have been referring to anal intercourse, and he claims that even the Rambam didn't permit anal intercourse, even though the Rambam does. Maybe he had a version that was censored. The Reishis Chachma in chapter 16 discusses this Gemara, and he basically misquotes the Rashi. Rush, and Rambam all basically speak about anal sex, and the Reishis Chacham comes and says that they were all referring to something else, to rear entry vaginal, apparently. Clear misquote. Sefer Charedim also comes in and misquotes Rashi and the Rambam and the Rush, and that's in Sefer Charedim in chapter 64. And we can't get into it at length. It's very, very lengthy. But then what happens is you have the Shla, the Yosef Kare, Yeshis Chachma, Sefer Charedim all lived in Tzfas in the 16th century, same time. Then you have the Shla who comes in just after them, and he endorses the Torah, except for the fact that the Torah permits anal sex. He says that you should not permit. For that you should follow the Sefer Charedim. So even though Sefer Charedim, if you study it, is very problematic. So what you have is, it was basically the 16th century scholars of Tzfas, in the wake of the Zohar's influence regarding wasting seed, that took this whole discussion about anal sex completely out of the picture. And in the next generation, when the Drisha came and said that if you permit anal sex, you can permit intercourse between limbs with climax, that discussion never matured. It never developed because it was basically written out. The anal sex discussion was written out of Jewish law, so this other discussion never developed. But what's interesting is that even though people assume that Yosef Kare in the Beis Yosef, when he says that a person should not perform anal sex to the point of climax because he should be conscientious of his soul, based on halachic reasons, he actually quotes that the Gemara Nida that if Rabbi Yochanan on Nadarim was the one permitting overturning the table, and Rabbi Yochanan on Nida forbade Zera Levatala, so it must be that Rabbi Yochanan on Nida on Nadarim meant without Zera Levatala. So therefore, even halachically, he said there's a question. The problem with that is that Rabbeinu Yitzchak knew about Nadarim and he knew about Nida, and he still paskined that you could do it to the point of climax. Why? Because he understood Nida was referring to, some say he says referring to birth control. A much simpler answer is that the Gemara Nida has nothing to do with the Gemara Nadarim, because the Gemara Nadarim is talking about sex with your wife. The Gemara in Nida is referring to, on the simple level, is referring to masturbation, which we have no reason, even Rabbeinu Yitzchak doesn't give us reason to compare those two. It seems that they still keep a distinction between them. In fact, the Gemara in Nida, Rabbi Yochanan there is being quoted to explain the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer is the one who said over there that you shouldn't hold your organ when you're urinating because it might come to wasted seed, right? But Rabbi Eliezer is quoted on Yavamis, Lamed Daled 34b, as saying that when you're married and your wife is nursing, if she has a baby and she's nursing, for the first 2 years, you should pull out during intercourse. Literally pull out to avoid pregnancy. Why? Because you don't want her to have another baby and then the milk flow might stop and the baby might be in danger. So you see that Rabbi Eliezer himself, who on Nida, is so strict about masturbation that you shouldn't even hold yourself when you're urinating. You shouldn't hold your organ when you're urinating. When it comes to marriage, when Moshe Feinstein explains it, when it comes to marriage for the sake of giving his wife her sexual pleasure, even when she's nursing, the husband should do it and pull out. So the fact that Rabbi Yochanan on Nida, Yigimel Amad Aleph, says that whoever wastes seeds deserves death, has nothing to do with Nadarim 20b, because Nadarim 20b is referring to a husband who has a sexual pleasure, and Nida Yigimel is either referring to masturbation or referring to Erev Ha'einin, which he references, which is referring to avoidance of pregnancy altogether. So they're completely not related. Not only that, the Beis Yosef comes and says that if Rabbeinu Yitzchak saw the Zayar, then he wouldn't, in the Bedek Abayis, Yosef Kari says that if Rabbeinu Yitzchak saw the Zayar, he wouldn't have permitted climax through anal intercourse. Both Avram David of Buchach in his Ezer Mekudesh to Even Ezer Simon Chafei, and Moshe Feinstein both point out that Yosef Kari himself never forbids it. He says that a person who's conscientious should beware. He says that if Rabbeinu Yitzchak saw it, he wouldn't permit it, but he never actually comes and said it's forbidden. And when you look at Shulchan Aruch, he doesn't permit it. He doesn't forbid it either. He kind of leaves it out. It's almost like he kind of didn't want to. It was like he on the one hand he has like over a dozen Rishonim who permit it, and he has a theory that maybe if he saw the Zayar he wouldn't have permitted it. So it's almost like Yosef Karo just wrote it out, which doesn't help us because it leaves the impression that it's forbidden. People generally almost approach halacha that if it doesn't say something is permitted, it means de facto implication is that it's forbidden. Even more so. What does Yosef Kari say? He says that if Rabbeinu Yitzchak had seen the Zayar, and now the Zayar says these things are so bad, wasting seed is so the worst sin, and the punishment is so bad, he wouldn't have permitted anal intercourse with your wife to the point of climax. But wait a second, we already had this question. We had Sanhedrin and Nadarim, which both seem to permit anal intercourse, and we had Yavamis 34b, which said that anal intercourse was the sin of Erev Ha'einin. How did Rabbeinu Yitzchak resolve it? He said that by Yavamis 34b, it was for the sake of birth control. It was constantly and for the sake of birth control. By Nadarim and by Sanhedrin, it was referring to for the sake of sexual pleasure, and it was only occasionally in the heat of passion. Therefore, you could say very simply that the Zayar, when the Zayar speaks against wasting seed in vain, even in the one place where it speaks against anal sex as an example of wasting seed in vain, it's talking about doing it constantly for the sake of pregnancy, of avoiding pregnancy. Whereas Rabbeinu Yitzchak would say, okay, that's like erva eining. But Sanhedrin, Nadarim, all these other things, it has to do with pleasure and bonding between husband and wife. It has nothing to do with that. And in fact, there's a commentary that says it. The Erech Shai to Even Ezer says exactly this thing. That the Zohar is referring specifically to, could be argued to say that the Zohar in Parshas Vayechi and Vayeshev, where it specifically says these harsh things about wasting seed, it's referring to specifically wasting anal, if in regard to anal sex at least, that it's constant and for the sake of birth control. And when you add to it that really the context there is masturbation, not intercourse, so it doesn't apply at all. So the Beis Yosef's argument, whether halachically from Nida or kabbalistically from the Zohar, is easily dismissed or pushed to the side. But the bottom line is that the damage was done. The damage was done that through his comment in the Beis Yosef that a person should be careful not to do it, and through the Perek Abayis, which said that the Zohar, if he saw the Zohar, he wouldn't have Ben Yitzchak wouldn't have permitted it, and the fact that he left it out of the Shulchan Aruch altogether, combined with the Reishis Chachma that came and said that anal intercourse was never what was being referred to on Nedarim, based on arguments that are easily dismissed, as we discuss in the book, and Sefer Charedim, whose arguments are easily dismissed, and the Shla, who's a father of the Chasidic-Charedi movement in many ways, a theological father. Basically what happened at that point was that Jewish sexual law took a major shift from, if you look at the facts, this is what they point to, that it took a shift from being very open and permissible to being extremely narrow and restrictive. To the point that today, when couples are taught about the law of what's permitted in bed, they're taught this, what was in the time of the Rishonim was the stringency. They're taught the stringency as if it was the baseline law. And they're taught that was what was the vast majority opinion in the time of the Rishonim as the baseline law. They're taught that that's a kula, which they need to get a heter for. When in reality, that's completely nonsense. The baseline law permits all these things. Yes, the drisha, someone might argue that the drisha is a lone opinion, because he's the only one who comes out clearly and says that you can even do, extra vaginal and extra anal manners of stimulation, which would include through the hand or the mouth of the wife, even to the point of ejaculation. I would argue that the reason for that is because, the discussion never developed, because it never got there. The whole discussion about anal sex was completely censored at that point, so you couldn't even discuss the question of intercourse between limbs. But the bottom line is the baseline law has now become the heter, and what was originally the stringency has become the baseline law, and it should be the opposite. We should be teaching couples that the baseline law is that all these things are permitted, and the view of the Shulchan Aruch is the stringency which you need a heter to do. You need to go to a Rav to get a heter to be stringent. Otherwise, you shouldn't be stringent. Now, it's not just the Rishonim, and this is where it's all going. Is that ultimately, even the Rama paskins like the Tosfos. The Rama says clearly there, after he brings the Rambam and then he brings the Rabbeinu Yitzchak, he says, and even though all these things are permitted, the person who sanctifies himself is considered holy. But clearly he says these things are permitted. The Rama paskins that way. The Levush in Even Ezer paskins that way. The Aruch HaShulchan in Even Ezer paskins that way. But we're not told any of these things. And I think it's harmful. I think many people would agree that it's harmful. And I think it's time for a change. just to add off, on this note, anyone who, if there are people who want to try to understand, want to learn the sources with a teacher, like I said, I am coming out with a book soon on the topic. But for Chassanim who want to study with someone who's investigating the sources more deeply, I personally don't, teach one-on-one, but I could connect you with people who I know are, investigating the sources more openly, and I could put you in touch with them if it's something you're interested in. You could actually contact me. Like I said, the book series is called Sexuality and Jewish Law. You could just email me at sexualityandjewishlaw@gmail.com.